Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the differences in gaming performance, if any at all, between Windows 7 and 10. Now the reason we're doing this is because when I originally started the channel, I used Windows 7 for benchmarking, and when support for that was coming to an end, I decided to make the jump to Windows 10, as I thought support's ending for 7, so people are probably going to be jumping to that, jumping to Windows 10, seeing as it was a free upgrade and all, and still is. So yeah, I decided to make the jump to Windows 10, but I found in Grand Theft Auto 5 in particular, at least on older CPUs, think Porta Duo and the such, performance was a hell of a lot worse than it had been on 7. So I went back to Windows 7 for a bit, and I eventually did make the sort of permanent jump to Windows 10. But yeah, it put that idea in the back of my mind. So a few videos ago, back in October I think, when I was testing the single core Sempron 3200 Plus, I linked that up there somewhere. I used Windows 10 for that, and during the conclusion for that, I was thinking, well, performance was really, really terrible, obviously, and performance probably would have been a lot better had I used an older operating system, Windows 7, even Windows XP. So that put the thought in my mind of maybe doing a comparison video between Windows 7 and 10, because I still remembered just how bad Grand Theft Auto 5 had been, which is why we're here today. And today we're specifically looking at gaming performance on Windows 7 and 10 with Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad CPUs. I'd originally been planning on doing a first gen i3 as well, but I don't have access to the DDR3 memory I use, so just Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad for today. And how we're doing the tests today is pretty much exactly like my usual CPU and graphics card reviews. So we're running the same roughly 30-minute section of a game on both operating systems, Windows 7 and 10. We're running each test twice, so we can take benchmark figures and then average them to get a more representative score of what performance is actually like. I'm also taking notes during the test of what the performance I actually see with my eyes, rather than just relying on the benchmark figures alone. And because we're doing comparative tests today, we also have to control for fairness, because if we don't do that, then we can't really compare the benchmark figures. So the way we're controlling for fairness is by using literally the exact same system. So that system features a Gigabyte GA EP45 DS3L motherboard, I think, the exact same 8GB of RAM, GTX 1080 ARM ROC from my personal system, and also running the games and operating systems from the same SSD and hard drive. Now, for the operating systems, I have a mostly clean Windows 7 install and a mostly clean Windows 10 install. And after each round of tests done on a CPU, I restore the image of an operating system to the hard drive. So when I go to test the next CPU, it's starting from the exact same mostly clean install that the other CPU did. And we're also using the exact same version of the NVIDIA driver as well. So for Windows 7, I think the latest one was 472.12, I'm not quite sure, but whatever it was, we're using that same driver version for Windows 10 as well. And speaking of the driver, one particular issue that cropped up on both operating systems was that because the CPUs we're testing today, the Core 2 Duo E7500 for Core 2 Duos and the Q8300 for Core 2 Quads, because they're not the greatest of CPUs, the frame rates during the games were often low enough that the graphics card clocks dropped, which I found to actually be causing a lot of issues like stuttering and hitches and things like that. And I managed to fix this by going into the NVIDIA control panel and changing NVIDIA's power management to prefer maximum performance. I had to do that for every game apart from CSGO for both CPUs. But yeah, just wanted to put that out there so you are more aware of what I've done to control for fairness between the systems. So I think that's everything. I'm not quite sure if I've forgotten anything that I needed to say. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's actually get on to the benchmarks. And first up is the Core 2 Duo E7500. So Kicking off comparisons for the E7500, CSGO is up first, using 1080p with the lowest settings. Uber shaders have also been left set to auto, which defaults to enabled. I'm not sure the footage quite shows it, but generally the E7500 was noticeably better performing in Windows 10 than it was with 7, which I wasn't expecting at all, to be honest. The benchmark figures are pretty similar, but overall the game just felt like it ran far smoother under the newer operating system. Both Windows 7 and 10 had noticeable stuttering throughout the test, a bot match on the Mirage map, but with 10 the stuttering seemed far less. Both could have dips in FPS, but they were worse with Windows 7, which could dip into the 20s more often than 10 did. FPS also tended to be higher, albeit only slightly on Windows 10 too. So overall, it's looking good so far for the newer operating system, 1-0 to Windows 10. 2016's Doom shows a far bigger gap in performance with the E7500, again in favour of Windows 10. 1080p is also being used here with the low settings preset, although I've turned the virtual texture paging size up to Nightmare, as this noticeably improved performance in testing. I'm assuming it allows the graphics card to store more of the game's textures, thus preventing the CPU from having to pull them from the system RAM, which is far slower than the graphics card's own memory. The game also needed the +jobs_numthreads2 command added to the game's properties in Steam, otherwise the game would run noticeably worse. The biggest, most noticeable difference in performance were the severe hitches, which could have the game freezing for multiple seconds at a time, that happened when using Windows 7, an issue I never saw with Windows 10. FPS throughout was generally far higher in Windows 10, although the most intense battles in the second mission, for example, could see both dropping to around 30 FPS, with the battle that happens once you get out of the airlock here causing a noticeable slowdown in the speed of the game. Performance between test runs could also be quite inconsistent on Windows 7, which is why you're not seeing all of the benchmark figures for that. So you can make that 2-0 for Windows 10 now, and this really wasn't what I was expecting going into the testing. GTA 5 is third for the games today. I'm basically testing them in alphabetical order, which makes it easier. Again, I'm using 1080p with the lowest settings here, but I've also disabled shadows completely through the game's configuration file to get the most performance out of the CPUs that I can. And in complete contrast to the two previous tests, Windows 7 is far and away the winner here. This was the game I noticed the biggest difference in when I started using Windows 10 for benchmarking a few years ago now, and was the main reason I went back to Windows 7 for testing for a bit. Both tests showed noticeable micro-stuttering for the most part, although with Windows 7, driving on the highway going towards the desert and driving through the mountains towards the FIB building was relatively smooth compared to the rest of the game, with only a little bit of stuttering, whereas Windows 10 had noticeable but brief hitches at times throughout gameplay. The biggest, most glaring issue though, which was at its worst in the city, was the texture and object popping that would happen when using Windows 10. You'd quite often see roads not render, and entire buildings just not being there at all. This can cause issues when trying to drive, as if it gets bad enough, you end up having to drive by memory, and can often end up crashing into things that just haven't been rendered yet. So Windows 10, at least in GTA 5 anyway, does seem to be putting more strain on the CPU when trying to stream textures in. The frame rate is also generally very erratic on Windows 10, so it's hard to put my finger on a general FPS figure for it, as it's constantly hitching. That makes it 2-1 to the newer OS now, so let's get on to the last game and see if Windows 7 can at least score a draw here, shall we? And lastly, at least for the Quarter Duo benchmarks anyway, is Skyrim. Specifically the original unmodded version of the game from 2011. The game is running at 1080p using the low settings preset here. I wasn't sure what sort of a difference, if any, there would be in this one, as the frame rate is capped to your monitor refresh rate. I use a 60Hz monitor for testing, so 60 FPS is the limit here, and the E7500 doesn't need to run at full build to achieve that frame rate. But despite that though, Windows 7 does edge ahead in performance. Both OSs have some noticeable but brief hitches when running through the woods towards Riverwood at the start of the game, with some more noticeable ones when going into the village itself. But the ones Windows 10 had did seem to be more noticeable. I also noticed that the CPU usage is higher than with Windows 7. It can also spike occasionally up to 100%, which causes the hitches to be more noticeable. It was a similar story throughout the rest of the test, with wherever Windows 7 had a little stutter, Windows 10 would have it too, just a bit more noticeable than it would be on 7. Neither test has the game being unplayable in any way, but Windows 7 again is objectively the better performer here. So that's it ended on 2-all. Not quite what I was hoping to show when I went into testing, but it is still an interesting result nonetheless. And we've still got the 4.2 quad benchmarks to go as well, so let's get on with that now. So in CSGO, again at 1080p using the same settings we used for the E7500, the gap in performance is far smaller, but there is still a gap and it is still in favour of Windows 10. Performance was actually reasonably similar, with both having slight but at least consistent levels of microstutter throughout, minor hitches occasionally, and both Windows 7 and 10 having FPS usually in the 60 to around the low to high 80s range, although it tended to be a bit higher with Windows 10. The minor microstuttering throughout was also slightly less noticeable with Windows 10 as well, and the FPS drops that can happen when there's lots of action happening on screen were also more severe with Windows 7, dipping into the 40s at times, whereas 10 could maintain at least the low 50s. So that's a win for Windows 10 so far. A small win, but a win nonetheless. Now, with 2016's Doom, also using the same settings as with the E7500, I was expecting performance to be better with Windows 10 as it was with the Core 2 Duo, but in fact it was actually worse, and noticeably so. I should point out though that I added the plusjobs numthreads4 command to the game's properties on Steam. This allows the game to use the maximum number of CPU threads available, which by default is set to -1, which means that the game will use the maximum number of threads available -1. So in theory, setting this command to the maximum number of available threads, 4 in the case of the Q8300, the game should perform a bit better than it would as standard. I know I did add this command for Windows 10, but I'm not 100% certain that I did the same for Windows 7, which could be a possible explanation for the difference. I'm more sure than not that I did do it, so we'll be running on the assumption that I actually did. Performance-wise, the difference was immediately noticeable. The game just seemed to run far smoother on Windows 7. With 10, the game had some minor hitches at points throughout, and a noticeable but slight amount of micro-stuttering throughout the first and second missions. The stuttering could get worse in big battles, with dips in FPS as low as the low 30s in the most intense scenes, such as the battle at the end of the first mission. Windows 7 did have moments with noticeable stuttering too, but not to the extent that Windows 10 did. The lowest it tended to dip FPS wise was around the low to high 40s. Otherwise, the game often appeared quite smooth on Windows 7. I'm really quite surprised Windows 10 did as bad in comparison to 7 here. I wasn't expecting the score to be 1-all after this test. So, as expected, well, not quite expected, but I had an inkling that this would be the case. GTA 5 performed worse under Windows 10. This again is with the same settings as before, so 1080p with the lowest settings and shadows disabled through the configuration file. The most noticeable differences in performance between the two were the brief but noticeable hitches that happened quite often throughout the game on Windows 10, and the texture and object pop-in, where the textures on roads and even entire buildings sometimes wouldn't render. This wasn't anywhere near as bad as it was with the dual-core E7500, but it was still quite noticeable. Windows 7 did still have issues with noticeable micro-stuttering throughout, although it wasn't as bad as on Windows 10. And the noticeable hitching that 10 had didn't happen on 7, so another win for Windows 7 here. I did things a little differently in Skyrim for the Q8300. Instead of using the low settings preset like with the E7500, I used the medium preset instead, as I wanted to make the game look a bit better, seeing as even the medium preset wasn't maxing out CPU usage. Both operating systems showed some minor hitches on the run through the woods towards Riverwood, with both having more noticeable stutters going into the village itself. Neither had any problems on the run up towards the temple, and both had some semi-noticeable stuttering at the same kind of points in the temple too, going into the first puzzle room for example. I think the stuttering was a little bit worse in Windows 10 than it was with 7, but I really think I'm having to nitpick here to find any differences. The benchmark figures aren't much different either, at least not noticeably so, but it is still technically a win for Windows 7 again. So, to conclude, I was actually quite surprised with how the tests went today. I was fully expecting it to be a landslide victory in favour of Windows 7, but what actually happened was, just looking at the Core 2 Duo E7500, was that it was a draw pretty much between Windows, not pretty much, it was a draw between Windows 7 and Windows 10. So you can't, at least from games I tested today, you can't really draw a conclusion about which one's better there, because it kind of depends on what games you want to play. And then looking at the Portrait Quad, that was more in line with what I thought, but still quite surprising, because that was 3-1 in favour of Windows 7. So the fact that Windows 10 was able to get at least one victory there in one of the tests, that shows that there's probably going to be other games where, on Core 2 Quads at least, Windows 10 is going to be much better than Windows 7. So, although 7 technically won, I'm not really confident in drawing a conclusion there either. So, I guess to conclude, I don't really have a conclusion. But saying that, the results we got today are still quite an interesting find for me, because, like I said, I was fully expecting Windows 10 to lose pretty miserably. And the fact that it didn't is still just as interesting, if not more interesting, than finding out that Windows 10 was going to be worse. But yeah, looking at the future, I do want to do more tests between Windows 7 and 10, so I definitely want to do at least the first gen Core i3 processor, maybe a Core i5 as well, but I might just do a review on our usual review on the i5s. I also want to look at if there's any performance differences for graphics cards between Windows 7 and 10 as well. So yeah, there's definitely going to be more Windows 7 versus Windows 10 videos in the future. So to finish off, I need to say thanks to Patreon supporters Mattis Derek and Shadow in the Void. You'll also be seeing lists of my other patrons somewhere in one of those directions. And if you'd like to support me in creating these videos as well, there'll be various links down below in the description where you'll be able to support me through different avenues. But yeah, I genuinely had fun making this video. Sometimes it can feel like a bit of a grind making the videos, but then you get videos like this and it's actually pretty interesting and fun making it, with a fairly surprising result coming from the tests. But yeah, that's going to be it for today. I'm not sure what I'm going to do a video on next, but yeah, that's going to be it for today. So hopefully you enjoyed my little look at the gaming performance differences between Windows 7 and 10, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.